Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a place that absolutely no one should drift back to, but here we are anyway, because history insists on being inconvenient. So go ahead and settle in. Dim the lights, adjust your blankets, make yourself far more comfortable than nearly anyone in ancient Rome ever was, and breathe a little slower, because we're about to wander, very gently, into the velvety shadows of Caligula's palace, where the carpets were plush, the marble was polished, and the general experience of being alive was only slightly better than being poked with a stick for entertainment, which, to be fair, also happened there sometimes. Now, despite what popular culture likes to pretend, the palace of Caligula wasn't all orgies and grapes and people reclining dramatically on couches, as of auditioning for an eternity-long fragrance commercial. No, most of the time it was fairly mundane, bureaucratic, even just bureaucratic with the added features of unpredictable violence, impossible demands, and a gentle background fear that you might accidentally make eye contact with the emperor and be executed for vibes. And then, layered on top of all that, there were the unfortunate people who ended up as palace slaves, and even more unfortunate still, those assigned roles that involve the emperor's, let's call it, personal interests. And look, if you're already thinking, I wouldn't last a day, you're correct. But don't worry, we're just here to observe quietly from a safe, sleepy distance. No participation required. So as we float backward, let's stop first at the most uncomfortable place imaginable. The exact moment when someone realized their life was about to revolve around the desires of a man famous for treating reality like a board game only he knew the rules to. Caligula had that special sort of energy we'd now call a walking red flag. The kind of person who would insult you, compliment you, punish you, and then ask for your honest opinion on dinner, all within one breath. And if you hesitated even slightly, well, that was unfortunate for you, and possibly for everyone in the room. Life in his palace had that soft, constant hum of anxiety, the kind that sits just behind your ribs and whispers, maybe today will be fine, but also maybe not. And for slaves, especially those caught in the emperor's orbit, the uncertainty was a constant companion. You never knew whether you'd be pouring wine at a banquet or suddenly pressed into some private duty you very much did not apply for. Because Caligula wasn't big on consent, boundaries, or anything resembling emotional intelligence. Let's drift a little deeper. Not too fast. Just enough to settle into the strange, dim environment of the imperial bedchambers and corridors. They were built to inspire awe. Gleaming ceilings, heavy curtains, silks that probably cost more than the average citizen made in their entire life. But for the enslaved people working there, the glamour was just a decorative frame around an exhausting, dehumanizing job. You had to anticipate moods, predict whims, know when to step forward and when to melt into the background like you never existed at all. And if you misjudged even slightly, you could expect consequences ranging from a casual slap to a lethal lesson. Imagine being a teenager, because a lot of them were, suddenly taken from your home, your family, your real life, and placed in this surreal palace where opulence mixed freely with nightmare logic. Imagine being told the emperor liked you, which, in Caligula's case, was about as reassuring as being told a lion found you interesting. And this is where things start to unfold slowly, in that way ancient Rome was so good at. A lot of Caligula's so-called personal attendants were selected not because they wanted the job, obviously, but because someone thought they were pretty, or quiet, or new, which was a quality Caligula appreciated because novelty was one of the few things he didn't get bored within minutes. Now, in a normal world, beauty might get you compliments or flattering glances. In Caligula world, beauty got you drafted, and once selected, you had no control over where your life went next. You might spend your days being paraded around like a decorative item, or being summoned for whatever the emperor felt he needed at that moment. And Caligula, famously, felt he needed a lot. The job came with its own strange rhythm, long periods of waiting, standing silently in hallways for hours, moving carefully, almost weightlessly, because loud footsteps irritated him, making sure you never looked too stressed. Which was deeply ironic, considering that the stress levels of imperial slaves were roughly equivalent to small woodland animals during hunting season. Let's float over to one of the palace banquets. They were grand, of course. Endless tables, heaps of food, fountains that poured wine, musicians playing until their fingers cramped. But the slaves working there had to keep track of everything. Who needed water, who needed a new plate, who had dropped something and needed it whisked away before Caligula noticed and turned it into a whole incident. And then there were the emperor's unpredictable moods. Sometimes he'd be generous. Other times he'd fling food. On a particularly whimsical evening, he might pick someone at random and mock them loudly for the entertainment of his guests. And all around him, the enslaved attendants were expected to smile politely while making themselves invisible. A difficult combination requiring the sort of emotional gymnastics that therapists today would charge hundreds of dollars to unpack. Now imagine doing all that while also knowing the emperor might summon you later for whatever private role he had in mind. Not because you did anything wrong, not because you did anything right, simply because he remembered your face at the wrong moment. Some historians try to soften this by calling it court service, which is adorable and also inaccurate. These people weren't employees. They weren't allowed to leave. They didn't have a say. Their bodies were tools of the state, or more precisely, tools of the emperor's impulses. It was like being trapped in the world's worst employment contract, except instead of signing it voluntarily, you were kidnapped, enslaved, and offered no PTO whatsoever. But the palace itself was strangely quiet at night. A heavy, velvety quiet. Oil lamps flickering along the hallways. The faint sound of distant footsteps. Maybe a servant whispering instructions to another. Maybe a guard yawning, because guarding Caligula's palace at night was less thrilling than it sounded. And within this dim stillness, the enslaved people would try to rest, knowing that any moment a messenger might appear, informing them the emperor was bored and required entertainment, or company, or an audience for whatever strange idea he'd just invented. Let's drift toward the emperor now, not too close, just enough to observe him from a safe emotional distance. He had that soft, pale look that wealthy Romans got from spending more time indoors than a modern teenager binge-watching entire seasons of anime. He liked luxury. He liked affection. He liked adoration. And he especially liked the kind that was mandatory, which meant the slaves around him had to constantly display something like devotion, even when he was being insufferable, which, again, was often. To be a palace slave, especially one caught in Caligula's personal orbit, was to perform. Every day, constantly, you had to act calm when you weren't. Act willing when you weren't. Pretend the emperor wasn't terrifying. Pretend you were grateful. Pretend everything was fine, while knowing full well it wasn't. It was a kind of emotional strain that stretched a person thin, like a thread pulled too tight. And yet, life went on. Even in the palace, people whispered, shared tiny jokes, tried to help each other survive. That's the thing about humans. Across all of history, even in Caligula's Rome, we formed little pockets of kindness in the middle of disaster. Sometimes a slave would quietly warn a younger one which hallway to avoid. Sometimes someone would bring a bit of extra food. Sometimes people would whisper stories at home to each other, reminding themselves they had once lived normal, quiet lives far away from all this. And as we settle deeper into the sleepy retelling, let's gently acknowledge the reality. For those trapped in Caligula's palace, especially as companions, the experience wasn't glamorous or romantic or scandalous in that Hollywood way. It was exhausting, dehumanizing, a life of constant adaptation, like a bird forced to change direction mid-flight again and again just to survive. Of course, ancient sources exaggerate. Suetonius enjoyed a good scandal. Later writers like to portray Caligula as a monster of pure chaos. But even if only a portion of the stories are true, it was still more than enough to classify palace service under the emperor's intimate direction as, let's say, less than ideal. And while Caligula's assassins eventually ended the chaos, nothing they did could return the lost years of the people trapped under his rule. Their stories, unfortunately, are mostly lost. Unnamed individuals caught in the shadow of a man whose every whim was recorded but whose victims remained anonymous. We'll drift away from Caligula in a moment, but before we go, it's worth remembering how fragile everything was in Rome. One emperor's boredom could reshape hundreds of lives. One bad day could erase someone completely. And for the enslaved people in the palace, Each sunrise was simply another spin of the wheel. Now, as we move along, let me ask softly, what would you have done if you found yourself in Caligula's palace, trying to stay unnoticed? Tell me in the comments if you're still awake. And with that, let's drift onward to the next quiet historical catastrophe. Let's keep drifting gently, as if we're gliding down one of those long Roman corridors where the oil lamps flicker just enough to look haunted, but not enough to actually illuminate anything useful. The palace of Caligula begins to fade behind us like a bad dream that lingers only as a feeling, a pressure in the chest, a reminder that power, when handed to the wrong person, can turn everything it touches into a sort of slow-motion disaster. We'll let that image settle for a moment. The kind of moment where the marble floors seem to hum with all the footsteps that once hurried across them. And then we drift forward, sliding quietly toward the next pocket of Roman life, where things were only slightly more stable. Not because Rome suddenly became functional, but because after Caligula, almost anything felt like an improvement. The empire, like a tired person waking up after a chaotic night, tried to pretend everything was normal again. Senators walk around with that tight diplomatic smile that says, let's never mention what just happened. Citizens carried on with their daily routines, and the palace staff, the enslaved workers who survived Caligula's reign, adapted with that weary resilience humans are so good at, the kind that whispers, well, that could have been worse, even though everyone knew it absolutely could also get worse again at any moment. Now, since we're drifting towards sleep, let's allow the palace atmosphere to become softer, quieter. The marble loses its echo. The torches dim into warm, fuzzy halos. The patterns on the wall blur slightly, inviting your thoughts to slow down with them. We're heading into the reign of Claudius next. Caligula's uncle, an emperor no one expected, but who somehow managed to keep Rome stitched together with a sort of confused determination. Claudius wasn't meant to rule, not in the way people plan these things. He'd spent most of his life being politely shoved aside during family gatherings, like that one relative everyone talks over because they assume he has nothing of value to say. He had physical disabilities, a stutter, and an unfortunate family reputation for being not all there, which was really just ancient Rome being rude, judgmental, and medically uninformed, a combination they excelled at. So when the Praetorian Guard found him trembling behind a curtain the day Caligula was assassinated, they weren't expecting to find their next emperor. And Claudius certainly wasn't expecting to be discovered like a startled house cat who'd wandered into the wrong room. But the guards, in their infinite political wisdom, decided this was convenient. And just like that, Claudius was declared emperor. Not because he demanded it, not because he schemed for it, but because he happened to be breathing, royal, and nearby. It was the Roman equivalent of picking the new manager by seeing who was still in the break room. The shift from Caligula to Claudius must have been surreal for the palace slaves, especially those who'd been caught in Caligula's personal life. Under Caligula, the palace was unpredictable, intense, and constantly on the verge of turning into a fever dream. Under Claudius, it became bureaucratic, tedious even, still stressful, but less impulsive cruelty and more long hours and administrative chaos. Claudius loved paperwork, or at least tolerated it better than the alternative. He spent hours reading petitions, signing documents, squinting at small print with the determination of someone trying to solve a puzzle they didn't ask for. This meant the palace became quieter, slower, less like a storm and more like an office where the boss keeps misplacing the files. But even here, in this comparatively calmer environment, the enslaved staff remained trapped within the same walls. Their freedom didn't magically appear because a new emperor sat on the throne. They still carried trays, tended lamps, fetched scrolls, endured insults, and interpreted moods. Only now they had to adapt to the whims of the imperial wives too. And Claudius had a taste in wives that can only be described as unfortunate. Let's drift toward Messalina, Claudius's third wife, and perhaps one of the most notoriously dramatic figures in Roman gossip. Historians portray her with the subtlety of a tabloid headline. Manipulative, promiscuous, ambitious, and about as stable as a wobbly stool on a windy day. Some of the stories, of course, are exaggerated. Romans loved slandering powerful women. It was practically a hobby. But even brushing aside the embellishments, Messalina was a lot. Imagine working in the palace during her time. You wake up each morning unsure whether she will be generous, paranoid, flirtatious, vengeful, or simply bored, which often caused the most chaos. Slaves feared her almost as much as they feared Caligula, though for different reasons. Caligula was unpredictable because he enjoyed it. Messalina was unpredictable because she was calculating, impulsive, or entertaining herself with schemes. There's a story, one of many, about her holding let's call it a competition, an intimate contest against a professional courtesan. And according to ancient writers, Messalina won by a landslide. Whether that story is true or just Roman imagination on a creative bender, we'll never know. But the fact that the rumor existed at all tells us what people thought of her. Powerful, indulgent, and entirely unbothered by consequences. Now imagine being an enslaved attendant assigned to her wing of the palace. You'd walk quietly, speak softly, and hope she didn't notice you too much or too little. In the palace, being ignored was as dangerous as being noticed, but for different reasons. If she paid too much attention to you, you might become tangled in one of her intrigues. If she forgot about you entirely, you might be blamed for something simply because you were nearby when she needed someone to accuse. There's a kind of exhausting alertness that comes from working under someone like that. The kind where your chest feels tight all day. The kind that makes sleep shallow and restless. And always, hovering in the background, was her gravitational pull, a force that dragged people into scandals without warning. Even Claudius, the emperor himself, struggled to keep up with her antics. He loved her, which made him blind to everything everyone else could see perfectly clearly. He thought she was loyal, devoted, a responsible partner. Meanwhile, Messalina was building her own power structures behind the scenes, gathering allies among the palace staff, and occasionally having someone executed for daring to oppose her. Probably not the ideal workplace environment. Let's pause here for a moment. Take a slow breath. Let the palace walls picture themselves around you, tall, cool, echoing gently with footsteps that are not your own. We're not rushing, just meandering. Picture an enslaved boy, maybe 15, maybe younger, carrying a tray toward Messalina's dining room. The olive lamps glow softly, casting shadows along his path. He tries to walk steadily, even though his hands tremble. He knows the story of the slave Messalina had punished last week. He knows the stakes. He knows she can be charming one moment, terrifying the next. And he quietly hopes she's already had her fill of amusement today. Another attendant, perhaps a young woman in her 20s, helps dress Messalina each morning. She ties the knots of silk carefully, smooths wrinkles, arranges jewelry, and pretends not to notice the way Messalina studies herself in the mirror with a critical, hungry expression. Someone who wants more than she has, even though what she already has is practically everything. This attendant knows that if Messalina doesn't like her hair today, or the drape of her gown, or the way the attendant breathed too loudly, then someone will suffer for it. It might be her. It might be someone else. But someone will. That was palace life. A delicate balance of timing, awareness, and luck. And yet, not everything was fear. Humans, even in captivity, find little sparks of normalcy. They share meals. They whisper jokes when the coast is clear. They watch the absurdity of elite life with a sense of surreal detachment. Because watching the Roman aristocracy manage their relationships was like watching a collection of wealthy cats fight over the same sunbeam. Dramatic, loud, mostly useless. As Messalina continued her affairs and schemes, the palace filled with tension. Rumors swirled like smoke. And eventually, one of her scandals grew too large to hide. Her mock marriage to a man named Gaius Silius while Claudius was away. Whether she genuinely wanted power, or simply enjoyed the thrill, or believed she could replace Claudius, no one knows. Ancients describe her as both dangerously intelligent and dangerously reckless, which is a combination that reliably ends with people dying. When Claudius discovered the wedding, he panicked. For someone who'd spent his whole life being underestimated, betrayal cut deep. Messalina tried to reach him, to throw herself at his feet and cry for forgiveness, but the guards blocked her. She died outside the palace, executed or driven to suicide, depending on which writer you believe. And with her gone, a heavy quiet settled over the imperial household. The enslaved staff, of course, weren't freed from danger. Power simply shifted to new hands. Claudius's next wife, Agrippina the Younger, whose ambition made Messalina look like an amateur. But before we drift into Agrippina's complicated universe, let's soften the scene once more. The corridors grow dim again. The marble cools. The palace exhales, as if relieved after surviving yet another storm caused by people who sincerely believed subtlety was unnecessary. And as we settle here, let me ask you quietly, if you had been a palace servant during Messalina's reign, would you have tried to stay invisible or tried to gather information to protect yourself? Tell me in the comments. If sleep hasn't claimed you yet, let's keep floating forward, slow and drowsy, like we're being carried down a long Roman hallway on a quiet draft of warm air. The echoes of Messalina's fall fade behind us, softening into memory, and the palace settles into a brief, cautious calm. It's the kind of calm that only exists after major scandal, when everyone is too tired to cause trouble, but also too anxious to truly relax. Claudius, now widowed yet again, wandered through his imperial duties with that familiar, slightly bewildered determination. He needed a new political partner, though what he actually required was someone gentle, supportive, perhaps someone who didn't view marriage as a strategic battlefield. Unfortunately for him, the woman who stepped into that role next was Agrippina the Younger, a woman whose ambition was sharp enough to cut marble. Agrippina entered the palace like a cold breeze. Not harsh, but precise. Purposeful. Every movement, every glance, every word she spoke carried calculation. For the enslaved staff who'd survived Caligula and Messalina, she was something new, something steadier, something smarter, which was comforting in some ways and deeply unsettling in others. She didn't lash out randomly. She didn't indulge in emotional theatrics. She didn't throw banquets that spiraled into madness. Instead, she treated the palace like a chessboard, and she moved pieces constantly. Let's drift into one of those still, polished rooms where she might be sitting, arranging scrolls, conversing with advisors, or quietly observing everyone around her with that assessing look she excelled at. For the enslaved people serving her, this made daily life feel different. Less chaotic than under Messalina, but also heavier, like the air itself had grown aware of politics. Agrippina had a presence that demanded attention without raising her voice. She didn't need to threaten openly. People simply understood the consequences of irritating her. You might not get yelled at. You might not even get punished immediately. But somehow, in some way, something in your life would go subtly off. A reassignment, a missing ration, a quiet demotion, a new supervisor who glared every time you breathed too loudly. This was a unique flavor of palace anxiety she brought with her. Quiet, controlled, cold around the edges. And into this carefully curated environment, she brought her son, Nero. He was around 16 when Agrippina married Claudius, though married is a strong word for what was essentially a political merger disguised as a bridal ceremony. Nero entered the palace like a fashionably moody guest at a party. He didn't want to attend, but also didn't want to leave. He had a softness about him, not physically, but emotionally, a certain fragile vanity, like a mirror that cracks if you breathe on it wrong. The enslaved staff noticed immediately. You can imagine them whispering to one another as they prepared his room. He's quiet, one might say. Yes, but he watches people, another replies. He looks gentle, someone suggests, perhaps try and be optimistic. So did Caligula as a baby, another quips, effectively ending the conversation. In those early days, before he became emperor, Nero enjoyed being admired. He loved music, poetry, performing. All things polite Roman society found embarrassing when done too enthusiastically. He practiced singing in halls, much to the discomfort of attendants forced to pretend it sounded divine. And not because he was terrible necessarily, but because their jobs depended on praising him with sufficient enthusiasm. Imagine being an enslaved boy dusting a shelf nearby, nodding and smiling as Nero practiced a dramatic monologue about some ancient hero, trying his absolute best not to grimace when Nero hit a particularly questionable note. And if he did grimace, just once, well, best to hope Nero didn't notice, because even as a teen, Nero loved being adored, and he never forgot a face that failed to adore him. Agrippina encouraged all this. She guided him with the steady hand of someone shaping a future instrument of power. Her ambition was simple: make Nero emperor instead of Claudius's biological son, Britannicus. The palace staff, of course, didn't get a say. They simply lived in the tension, the quiet battle lines drawn between mother and stepson, between Nero and Britannicus, between the old loyalties and the rising ones. Every dinner became a test. Every glance between Agrippina and Claudius held layers of strategy. Every birthday celebration for Britannicus contained a strange, uncomfortable air, like the room itself felt guilty for witnessing something that would end badly. Let's drift into one of those dinners. Just for a moment, the lamps glow softly. The marble floors reflect warm gold. Slaves move quietly, pouring wine, presenting dishes, adjusting table cushions. Claudius sits at the head, older now, more tired, distracted by his own paperwork. Agrippina sits beside him, poised, attentive, smiling with an edge. Nero sits near her, steeping in a mixture of teenage arrogance and mother-fed ambition. Britannicus sits near the opposite end, nervous, overshadowed, watched too closely by the guards. And in the background, the enslaved boys and girls serving them can feel the weight of the atmosphere. They know something is shifting. They don't know exactly what, but they feel it the way birds sense storms before clouds appear, instinctively. Claudius, bless him, seemed almost unaware of the power struggle forming in his own house. Or maybe he noticed but lacked the strength to address it. He'd spent a lifetime underestimated, and that kind of early conditioning settles deep into the bones. Changing patterns becomes difficult, and Agrippina was very convincing whenever she wanted him to sign something. Her influence became so obvious that even the slaves whispered about it. Some said she controlled the emperor. Some said she controlled everyone. Some quietly believed she was the smartest person in the building, which she probably was on most days. But in politics, intelligence is dangerous. And ambition, when mixed with intelligence, becomes lethal. As Nero grew older, Agrippina pushed him into the spotlight. She organized public appearances. She made him the focus of court gossip. She made him visible, important. And finally, she convinced Claudius to adopt Nero formally, a move that placed him ahead of Britannicus in the line of succession. The palace staff watched all this with the weary resignation shared by people who know exactly where the story is heading, but also know they're helpless to stop it. They'd seen this pattern before: ambition, rivalry, poisonings, executions. The details changed, but the rhythm was familiar. And then Claudius died. Officially, it was an illness. Unofficially, the rumors swarmed like flies around a feast. Some whispered that Agrippina fed him poisoned mushrooms, a theory so popular that even centuries later historians repeat it with a sort of amused shrug. Whether or not it's true, the palace slaves certainly believed it. You can almost imagine their hushed voices in the corridors. Of course she poisoned him. Yes, but can you blame her? Honestly, it was inevitable. And so Nero became emperor at 17. For the enslaved staff, this meant another shift in the emotional climate. A new gravitational center forming around a teenager with too much vanity and too little self-awareness. At first, things were surprisingly calm. Nero relied on advisors. He listened to Seneca and Burrus. He didn't do anything catastrophic. Some even thought he might mature into a decent ruler if given enough guidance and snacks. Agrippina, meanwhile, expected to remain the power behind the throne. She imagined Nero as the face of the empire and herself as the mind. But Nero was, Nero, a young man who wanted approval, freedom, music, applause. He didn't want to be told what to do by his mother, even if she was significantly better at doing imperial things. The tension thickened. Slaves carrying scrolls into Nero's study noticed the way he tensed when Agrippina entered. Servants adjusting lamps in Agrippina's room noticed the way she complained about Nero's choices. The palace again became a stage where political family drama echoed down the hallways. And throughout all this, the enslaved attendants lived in cautious silence. Not because they didn't care who won the power struggle, but because choosing sides was suicidal. Agrippina punished disloyalty with cold precision. Nero punished it with emotional volatility. And both of them, in their own special ways, were exhausting. There's a soft melancholy in imagining the daily lives of those attendants. People whose survival depended on reading facial expressions more accurately than any modern psychologist. People who'd seen emperors come and go, seen the games of elite families unfold again and again, each time with new costumes but the same tragic script. Eventually, of course, the tension between Nero and Agrippina snapped. He removed her influence, restricted her access to the palace, took away her guards, moved her into a separate house, and finally, in a famously incompetent assassination attempt involving collapsing boat, he had her killed. It's grim, but it's also so Roman, and after Agrippina's death, Nero changed. He became more indulgent, more theatrical, more unpredictable. Not Caligula level unpredictable, but the kind that makes the palace staff whisper, "Ah, here we go again." But before we drift deeper into Nero's reign, his performances, his fires, his melodramatic self-pity, let's pause in this dim marble hallway where the air feels cool on your skin and the lamps glow like floating suns. Let the sound settle. Let your thoughts drift with it. And softly, let me ask you, if you were an attendant in Nero's early palace, before things went truly downhill, would you have trusted Agrippina or tried to stay far away from her? Tell me your thoughts in the comments if you haven't drifted off yet. Let's drift back into the soft corridors of ancient excess, still wandering to the marble echoes of Caligula's palace, where the lamps never seem to dim and the scandals never really ended. If you're still awake from the last part, well, impressive. If you drifted off and just woke up with no memory of what happened, that's perfectly on brand for a Caligulan evening too. Most people in his palace also had no idea what was going on, except their confusion usually came with a higher likelihood of being dragged into something they absolutely did not consent to. So let's pick up where we left off, right around Caligula's later years, when his appetites were expanding in every direction, mostly because no one had the authority or the desire to say, maybe don't do that. By this point, he had already earned himself the delicate nickname, that little monster from half the palace servants, whisper behind curtains as softly as possible. It was a Roman version of a workplace Slack message, except instead of worrying about HR, you had to worry about being thrown into an arena with a disgruntled ostrich. Caligula had phases, as all great eccentrics do. Unfortunately for everyone around him, none were harmless phases like collecting pottery or experimenting with bread recipes. His newest interests involved turning the palace into a living catalog of bodies, not for art, not for anatomy, certainly not for anything dignified. He wanted a collection, curated with all the absurd care of man preserving rare coins, except the coins were human beings who didn't get to vote on the job description. By now, his personal attendants had accepted that his sense of privacy functioned like a dissolved tablet, completely melted away and leaving no trace behind. His nights blurred into a mixture of forced entertainment, performative affection, and the kind of theatrics that made the senators privately ask themselves if maybe Zeus had cursed Rome just a little too enthusiastically. One of Caligula's more peculiar fixations was his belief that divinity worked like a contagious disease. If he stood close to someone long enough, especially someone attractive, he seemed to believe they were blessed simply by proximity to his radiance. He would gesture at one of the enslaved boys or girls and announce, with the confidence of a man who hadn't slept in 3 days, "Behold, a creature transformed by my presence." Meanwhile, the transformed creature was usually just desperately trying to look at the floor in a way that wouldn't upset him. You can picture them thinking, "Please, great emperor, transform me into something far away from here." But, as always, imperial delusion trickled down into policy. Soon enough, there was an entire network of attendants whose job was simply to stand near Caligula and agree that he glowed. A few senators had to try it too. One nearly fainted from the exertion of praising Caligula without pause for half an hour. Naturally, Caligula rewarded him by requiring him to do it again, just in case the gods missed the first performance. And through all of this, the enslaved people, especially those chosen for private service, had to maintain the delicate expression of peaceful neutrality. Not too sad, not too afraid, not too bored. The wrong expression could mean a punishment so elaborate that it made Greek tragedies look like cheerful sitcom episodes. When Caligula felt particularly divine, he expected his attendants to worship him in the soft, reverent tones normally reserved for actual temples. Meanwhile, palace rumors suggested he once demanded a lemon cake shaped like Jupiter's head and ate the whole thing with his hands. Divinity, it seems, is best enjoyed with crumbs. Let's drift through one of the more infamous episodes involving Caligula's intimate retinue, as the palace scribes politely phrase it to keep their jobs. There was one evening when Caligula won a performance, a soft, whispered reenactment of a myth where he played every major role and the enslaved participants had to fill in the rest. The myth changed halfway through. The roles changed every 5 minutes. The expectations changed every time Caligula blinked. One poor participant, a young man from Thrace, tried to follow along but got confused about whether he was supposed to be a nymph, a satyr, or a tree. Caligula, of course, found this delightful. A transformation, he declared grandly, as though the man had just invented interpretive dance. This wasn't the worst thing that happened in the palace, by far, but it speaks to the constant unpredictability that hovered around those forced into Caligula's inner circle. Their days weren't marked by tasks, they were marked by moods. A day could start normally, with breakfast and sunbeams on the courtyard, and then suddenly turn into a midnight procession because Caligula decided the moon was ignoring him. He once commanded several enslaved people to sing lullabies to the moon so it would feel included. It's hard to know if the moon appreciated it, but Caligula certainly did. One girl fell asleep, standing up during the song. Amazingly, she survived mostly because Caligula interpreted it as a divine trance. But as the palace spiraled deeper into unpredictable rituals, word of Caligula's behaviors began spreading to the Senate in ways that were increasingly impossible to ignore. Senators would whisper nervously over their wine cups. He made Dionysus cry. He threatened to replace the entire Senate with horses. He married a woman, divorced her, remarried her, and then tried to marry her sister, all in 1 month. Meanwhile, enslaved attendants circulating in the background would keep their expressions blank, because acknowledging these conversations could get them punished. They lived in a world where everyone was aware something was very wrong, yet no one could safely say it. Among Caligula's retinue, there were unofficial elders, older enslaved women, and men who had survived multiple emperors. They would gently warn newcomers with soft phrases like, "Don't answer too quickly," or "Never let him see you yawn," or if he asks who the most beautiful person in the palace is, the answer is always him, unless he looks sad, in which case the answer is still him but slower. Those elders kept people alive. They knew all the unspoken rules, like how to walk just slightly behind Caligula, how to fold his cloak in a way that soothed him, or when pretend they didn't hear something alarming. And their presence gives us a window into something tender hidden beneath all the cruelty. People caring for one another. Despite being trapped in the worst place imaginable, they whispered comfort in dark corners, shared stolen figs on quiet nights, and helped one another stay alive in a world designed entirely around the whims of a man who barely acknowledged their humanity. If there was any softness in Caligula's palace, it came from those who received none themselves. Let's drift into a quieter moment, because even Caligula had downtime, though downtime for him usually meant plotting something inconvenient. One warm evening, the palace was unusually still. Caligula, exhausted from an entire day of trying to convince visiting ambassadors that he controlled the weather, finally retreated to his private chamber. The attendants outside sat in the hallway, resting their backs against cold marble walls. Someone hummed a soft tune in their native language. Someone else braided their hair with small beads they'd kept hidden for months. For a brief moment, the palace breathed like a normal place. Then Caligula called for wine, and the tranquility evaporated like dew. 2 attendants rushed in, offering different cups. Unsure which mood he was in, he picked one, tasted it, and declared it too mortal, which was never a good sign. The attendant who poured the wine stared at the floor, probably calculating every decision that had led to this moment. But instead of punishment, Caligula simply waved his hand and demanded a story, one he'd already heard 100 times, but apparently wanted to hear again, except slower, then faster, then slower again. The storyteller navigated this with the careful precision of a boat steering through a minefield. And somehow, miraculously, Caligula fell asleep before he could change his mind again. Stories were, oddly enough, a form of survival in the palace. Many enslaved people discovered Caligula was calmer when he was distracted, so they developed entire webs of narratives, half myth, half fiction. Caligula preferred stories where he was the hero or the villain, or sometimes both. He adored legends about gods who punished mortals for looking at them incorrectly. You can imagine why. His fondness for stories eventually resulted in a bizarre command. He wanted his attendants to reenact entire myths in the courtyard, with costumes, with props, with enthusiasm. It was ancient Rome's least voluntary community theater. Some performances were harmless. Someone playing a tree, someone else pretending to be the wind. Others were less harmless, especially when Caligula insisted the stories end with him being praised by the gods for simply existing. The audience, consisting mostly of terrified senators and equally terrified attendants, applauded with a nervous intensity of people who absolutely wanted to live. But the thing about Caligula's world, his glittering, unpredictable universe, is that it couldn't last. Even for Rome, which tolerated an unbelievable amount of imperial nonsense, there was a limit. Senators were getting restless. The Praetorian Guard was getting uncomfortable. And the enslaved attendants, well, they were often the first to notice when a storm was brewing. They saw the worn-down faces of guards, the hushed conversations behind half-closed doors, the sudden stiffness in the air. Something was shifting. One older attendant, a woman who had survived Tiberius, Sejanus, and now Caligula, whispered to a newcomer one evening, "When emperors burn too brightly, Rome puts out the flame." A soft, matter-of-fact truth. A truth learned through decades of watching powerful men destroy everything around them until someone finally said enough. Caligula, of course, had no idea. He was too busy planning a new performance where he wanted to appear as Apollo rising from a sunbeam. He had already instructed the attendants to gather gold paint and prepare the stage, Rome's most involuntary art department. Meanwhile, several Praetorian officers were deciding that maybe Rome didn't need another divine sunrise. And that sets us gently on the edge of what comes next. Not the dramatic assassination you may be expecting, but the slow unraveling of a world built on fear, privilege, and theatrical chaos. Before the fall, though, there were still a few final nights of Caligulan excess, and the people trapped closest to him felt every strange vibration. Before we drift to that final unraveling, what would you have done if you were an enslaved attendant in Caligula's palace? Whisper your thoughts softly into the comments. If you're still awake, of course. Let's drift onward. Let's settle back into the dim corridors of Caligula's palace, where the torches burned low and the air always carried a faint mix of incense, wine, and the quiet dread of people who were constantly waiting to see which version of their emperor they'd be dealing with that day. If you're listening with your eyes half closed, imagine the marble floors cool underfoot, echoing with soft steps and softer whispers. We're drifting into the final stretch of Caligula's chaotic reign, when things are beginning to fray at the edges. Slowly, quietly, almost politely, like a tapestry unraveling stitch by stitch. By now, everyone in the palace had developed a sixth sense for danger. It wasn't something they learned. It was something the palace itself taught them through repetition. A particular way Caligula tilted his head. A particular silence before he spoke. The slight twitch in his eye that meant he might either reward someone with gold or command them to reenact the fall of Troy using only a bedsheet and a questionable set of moral guidelines. When you lived near Caligula, you had to treat unpredictability like weather. You checked for signs. You adjusted your mood. You hoped the storm clouds passed in another direction. Among the enslaved attendants, there was quiet talk that the emperor had been more restless lately, more paranoid. He didn't sleep well. No surprise given his lifestyle, and he tended to roam the palace in the middle of the night, demanding that lamps be lit, musicians be summoned, or that someone explain to him why the stars were arranged so offensively. Some nights, he paced the halls muttering about betrayal in the Senate. Other nights, he was convinced the gods were speaking to him through the sound of the fountains. And on one particularly strange evening, he claimed to have seen a vision of himself crowned in a halo of fire, though it turned out to be the reflection of a torch hitting a polished shield at a strange angle. You would think the palace staff would find all of this exhausting, and they did, but exhaustion wasn't the kind of thing you complain about in Caligula's world. You simply learned to nap in 5-minute increments, leaning against pillars or sitting behind curtains, jolting awake whenever someone shouted his name. And yet, despite the chaos, there were still small moments of humanity. Someone would sneak a handful of dates from the kitchen and share them. Someone would whisper a joke, very quietly, very carefully, about Caligula's latest divine revelation. Those tiny moments kept them from sinking completely into despair. They were small rebellions, soft ones, the kind that didn't topple empires but kept souls alive. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, Rome was shifting. Senators were grumbling more loudly. The Praetorian Guard was becoming bolder in their private commentary. Even the general atmosphere in the city, the street musicians, the taverns, the bathhouses, carried a faint undercurrent of tension. People had loved Caligula at first. In that hopeful way citizens often love a new ruler, imagining fresh beginnings. But by now, they had run out of fresh illusions. Rome's laughter had thinned. The jokes about the emperor were whispered, not shouted, and whispered jokes in ancient Rome were rarely a good sign. Back inside the palace, Caligula was doubling down on his eccentricities, as though he sensed, somewhere in the fog of his self-deification, that the world wasn't admiring him as enthusiastically as he expected. And so he performed. He announced a divine feast where the guests weren't allowed to eat until he finished giving a speech about his own greatness. The speeches usually lasted many hours and featured such inspired moments as, "I am beloved by the gods," followed by a long pause during which everyone nodded fervently, just in case the gods were watching. He also became more demanding with his private attendants, especially those in his forced personal service. Their duties expanded into rituals that made very little sense to anyone except Caligula. One morning he insisted on being greeted as daybreak, which confused the staff because it was nearly noon. Another day he asked to be wrapped in purple cloth and carried around like a divine infant, which required a group of very tired men to hoist him on their shoulders, while he complained about the quality of the winds touching his face. Still, the attendants did it because they had no choice, and because after surviving years under Caligula, you didn't question orders unless you had a strong preference for danger. But even more unsettling than his theatrics was a new paranoia creeping into his voice. He started suspecting conspiracies everywhere. In the Senate, among the guards, among his own family. One poor attendant made the mistake of asking if he wanted more water. Caligula froze, stared at him for a long moment, and whispered, "Why would I need your water?" It took 3 days for the attendant to earn back enough trust to pour anything again. Even then, he did it with hands so steady you'd think he was made of marble. Most people in the palace started speaking less, moving slower, planning every expression. They were tired, bone-tired, but careful. And yet Caligula kept ordering new spectacles, new fantasies, new humiliations for anyone unlucky enough to be near him. He once commanded a group of enslaved workers to pretend to be sea spirits guiding him across a shallow pool, which mostly involved them splashing gracefully while he strutted through ankle-deep water. He proclaimed it a triumph, naturally. But the turning point, the soft, nearly invisible tipping of the scales, came during a festival he planned to honor himself. Because why honor a god when you can honor yourself, the very important emperor who had once decided he was capable of defeating the ocean? He demanded songs praising his beauty. He demanded dancers from all corners of the empire. He demanded golden confetti, which looked beautiful until people realized the gold had been scraped from palace decorations, leaving everything slightly patchy. The attendants who were forced to coordinate all of this spent the entire evening running in quiet panic, trying to meet his expectations while avoiding his temper. At this festival, Caligula arranged a sort of parade featuring members of his private retinue, those he kept closest, in all the ways one would rather not be kept. He dressed them in costumes representing gods, nymphs, and spirits of the household. Some costumes were elegant, others were absurdly small or awkwardly heavy. And because Caligula believed that humiliation made people more pure, he instructed several attendants to bow whenever the crowd clapped, regardless of whether the applause was for them or not. The audience wasn't sure how to react. Senators clapped because their lives depended on it. Roman citizens clapped because they feared refusing would be noted. Caligula clapped because he believed the whole thing was magnificent. But while he basked in his grand display, the Praetorian Guard watched quietly from the edges, exchanging glances. They were growing increasingly uncomfortable with the emperor's treatment of their fellow Romans, of the Senate of the city, and certainly of the enslaved staff, who were treated as little more than living ornaments. Guards weren't sentimental, but they liked stability, and Caligula was approaching a level of instability usually reserved for mythological kings punished by the gods. Over the next weeks, Caligula's behavior only intensified. He invented new rules. He destroyed old ones. He held midnight feasts where everyone had to pretend they weren't exhausted. He accused random senators of imaginary insults. He accused household staff of looking at him incorrectly. His personal attendants learned to walk with their heads angled very carefully. Not too high, not too low, because anything could be interpreted as disrespect. But beneath the noise and theatrics, something inside the palace was beginning to fracture. The older attendants sensed it first. They always did. One evening, as they cleaned up after yet another imperial tantrum, an older woman whispered, "Changes are coming," not in a hopeful tone, not even in a fearful one, just a gentle recognition that the air in the palace felt different. Heavy, thick, waiting. Caligula didn't notice. He was too busy planning another divine reenactment, this time involving him as a reborn Hercules. He ordered lion skins, olive wreaths, and an elaborate stage set with painted mountains. The attendants built it. They painted the props. They rehearsed walking patterns, so they wouldn't trip during the performance. And as they worked, they exchanged quiet, knowing looks, not because they knew what was coming next, but because they knew something was. The night before the performance, the palace was unusually quiet. Even Caligula seemed subdued, muttering to himself as he stared into the reflecting pool. His attendant stood nearby, as always, waiting for whatever command he might give. But he said nothing, just watched his reflection ripple. Maybe he sensed the end. Maybe he sensed nothing at all. With Caligula, you could never be sure. And so, as the palace drifted into sleep, or something close to sleep, the attendants exchanged soft words in the hallways. Little goodnights, small reassurances, weak smiles. They lived each day like it might end suddenly, not because they were dramatic, but because that was simply the reality of living under Caligula. And now, more than ever, it felt true. Before we drift into the quiet, eerie final days of his reign in Part 6, tell me, softly, if you have been one of those attendants preparing props for Caligula's ridiculous Hercules performance, what role would you have fake enthusiasm for? Leave your sleepy thoughts in the comments, and let's continue onward. Let's drift back into those dim palace corridors, still warm with lamplight and the lingering tension of people who knew something was shifting but didn't dare name it. We left Caligula standing beside his reflecting pool, staring at his own rippling face with a strangely quiet intensity. It was one of the few times in his reign when even his attendants didn't know what move might come next. And that uncertainty, more than anything else, made the air feel heavier than usual, like Rome itself was exhaling slowly, preparing for something it couldn't quite see. By dawn, the palace was stirring again, though no one seemed fully awake. People moved softly through the halls, too tired to pretend enthusiasm, but too afraid not to. Caligula had demanded preparations for the Hercules performance continue at sunrise, so his attendants went about their tasks with that familiar combination of dread, routine, and careful precision that had kept them alive for years. They adjusted the painted mountains, tested the curtains, polished the shields that would reflect torchlight dramatically onto the emperor's face. They practiced lifting the lion skin prop. It was surprisingly heavy, and whispered among themselves in low tones about everything and nothing, just to feel human for a moment. The older attendants were even quieter than usual. They exchanged looks that said more than words ever could. It wasn't fear exactly. It was that sense you get before a storm, when the wind changes direction, and you're not sure if you should take shelter or simply watch. They lived through enough imperial madness to recognize when something was coming to an end. Not necessarily a good end, not necessarily a bad one, just an end. Caligula, meanwhile, was in an unusual mood, restless but not furious, confident but slightly distracted, like a man who had rehearsed a story so many times he'd started to forget the details. When the attendants helped him dress in his Hercules costume, he complained about the fit of the lion's skin, then praised it 2 seconds later, then declared that perhaps Hercules himself would have wanted him to wear it crooked. They nodded thoughtfully, as though this made perfect sense. If Caligula said the sun rose sideways, they would have agreed with that too. The performance began in the late afternoon, on a raised platform in one of the palace courtyards. Torches flickered in the warm breeze, casting long shadows across the mosaic floor. Senators assembled, pretending eagerness. Guards lined the edges, pretending vigilance. Attendants hid their exhaustion behind controlled movements. And Caligula, of course, entered like he expected applause from all of Olympus. He launched into the performance with the enthusiasm of a man who had never doubted himself for a single second. His voice boomed as he proclaimed his godlike strength, though one could argue that the lion's skin was doing most of the dramatic work. His attendants shuffled through their roles. Nymphs, monsters, unlucky villagers, various mythological inconveniences. One man had to pretend to be a hydra, though the makeshift costume mostly resembled a pile of laundry. Caligula didn't seem to notice. He was too absorbed in gesturing heroically at the sky. And yet, underneath the spectacle, something felt off. Not from Caligula. He was performing exactly as one would expect. Loudly, erratically, with the dramatic flair of a man who had never heard the word subtlety. The problem was the guards. They looked tense, stiff, too alert for a show that usually bored them to tears. Some kept glancing at each other. Some kept scanning the crowd. A few stood so rigidly still that the attendants began noticing. One of the older attendants, standing near the back with a prop shield, watched the guards with narrowed eyes. She had lived long enough to know when men were preparing to do something they might regret. She murmured under her breath, "It's coming soon." No one heard her. No one needed to. The words hung in the air like a whisper of fate. Caligula, oblivious as always, continued his monologue about divine power. He raised his arms dramatically, waiting for thunder or applause. Neither happened. After an awkward pause, the senators forced polite clapping, which sounded more like a group of people slapping their legs in self-defense. Caligula accepted it as though he were receiving praise from the gods themselves. Eventually, performance ended. Not because Caligula wanted it to, but because he became distracted by a bird flying overhead. He pointed at it with sudden suspicion. "Do you think it's watching me?" he demanded. No one had a safe answer to that. The attendants simply bowed their heads until he lost interest. The evening slipped into a soft, strangely quiet atmosphere. Usually after a spectacle like that, Caligula would demand a feast or music, or at least a round of exaggerated compliments. But tonight he wandered off without explanation, leaving his attendants standing in the courtyard, uncertain whether they were dismissed or supposed to follow. A few did follow out of habit. The rest lingered hesitantly, waiting to be called, but no call came. Caligula retreated to his private chambers, pacing restlessly. He muttered to himself, laughed suddenly, then frowned at nothing. He opened a window, stared out at the night, closed it again. One attendant, standing quietly nearby, watched him with the expression of someone witnessing a slow-moving disaster they couldn't interrupt. The emperor's moods always ebbed and flowed, but this one felt different, hollow, stretched thin like a piece of fabric worn down from too much sunlight. Later, when Caligula finally settled into a chair, he asked a simple question. "Do you think they adore me?" His voice was soft. Not insecure, he wasn't capable of insecurity, but contemplative, as though he genuinely expected an answer that mattered. The attendant nodded. "Yes, Caesar." Caligula nodded too, as though confirming something to himself. "Good," he said, "because there are so many fools in the city." And then, almost sleepily, "But they forget that I am eternal." He fell asleep not long after, slumped sideways like a child who had lost a battle with gravity. The attendants adjusted his cloak and dimmed the lamps. For a moment, he looked almost peaceful, just a tired young man worn down by his own imagination. Almost sympathetic, if one forgot everything he had ever done. But sympathy was not something anyone in that palace could afford. The next day unfolded with that same thick, waiting quiet. It was subtle, like the silence before dawn. Attendants moved carefully, as always, but their eyes flicked toward the guards more often. The guards seemed unusually composed. Too composed. Their gaze lingered on Caligula a little too long. Their hands rested a little too close to their weapons. Even the palace animals sensed something. The horses seemed restless. The dogs refused to settle. Rome had an uncanny way of knowing when a ruler's time was ending, even before the people realized it. Caligula awoke in an agitated mood. He complained that the sun was too bright, then that it was too dim. He demanded wine for breakfast, then shouted at it for not tasting divine enough. He ordered several attendants to follow him to the theater for a rehearsal of yet another performance, even though the last one had barely ended. They obeyed, of course, though with a creeping sense of unease. The theater was cavernous and dimly lit, with long shadows stretching across the stage. Caligula stood at the center, giving directions with bored impatience. He pointed at props, criticized the lighting, instructed several attendants to stand in specific positions just so he could complain that they looked uninspired. And all the while, the guards stationed around the edges watched silently. A few exchanged glances. One subtly shifted his stance. Another placed his hand on the hilt of his dagger in a way that looked casual, but wasn't. The attendants were the first to feel it, something tightening in the air, like a string about to snap. They straightened. They slowed their steps. They tried not to draw attention to themselves. But Caligula noticed nothing. He was too absorbed in a rant about how the gods communicated poorly with mortals. And then, in a moment so quiet it was almost gentle, everything changed. A guard stepped forward. Another followed. Caligula frowned, confused but not afraid. He opened his mouth, perhaps to demand an explanation or to accuse him of disrupting his divine flow. But the guards moved quickly, too quickly for him to process. The attendants froze. One of them dropped a prop, the soft clatter echoing like a warning too late to matter. What followed happened in seconds. Sharp, swift, decisive. And though you and I know the historical details very well, we don't need to dwell on them. This is a sleepy story. After all, we can soften the edges. We can say that Caligula's reign ended as abruptly as it had begun. In confusion, in shock, in the sudden collapse of a man who believed himself untouchable. The attendant stood perfectly still, not cheering, not crying, just breathing deep, uncertain breaths of people who weren't sure they were next or they were finally, blessedly free. When it was over, a strange quiet filled the space. A quiet so big it felt like a whole new world opened around them. The guards gave quick orders. The senators were summoned. Rome shifted, yet again, into another chapter. But the attendants, they didn't move at first. Some stared at the floor. Some stared at the walls. A few looked at each other with expressions that held years of exhaustion in them. Finally, an older woman whispered, "It's done." And in that whisper was a lifetime of relief and sorrow and uncertainty. Because when an emperor fell, no one knew what came next. But they knew, at least, that the storms of Caligula's madness had passed. As the palace slowly reorganized itself, the attendants went about their tasks with shaky steps. They tidied the theater. They put away the props. They cleaned the spilled wine from breakfast. All the things they had always done. Only now, without the oppressive weight of his presence pressing down on them. It felt strange. It felt unreal. It felt like breathing after years underwater. Before we drift onward to what happened after Caligula, the scrambling, the panic, the quiet reordering of imperial life, tell me softly, in the comments, if you had been in that theater, frozen in place as the world shifted, what emotion do you think would have hit you first? Relief? Fear? Shock? Leave your gentle thoughts below, and we'll keep drifting. Hey everyone, let's drift back into quiet, dim corridors of imperial Rome, where everyone's toga was slightly wrinkled, everyone's morals were even more wrinkled, and the palace staff continued pretending that this was all perfectly normal. We left off gently wandering through the uneasy world of Tiberius's court, the strange mixture of fear, boredom, and questionable hobbies that defined the twilight years of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Now we can settle deeper into the chaos that came after. Because naturally, the universe looked at the situation and said, "You know what this needs? Caligula." So tonight, as we drift further into the slow-flowing river of peculiar history, let's step softly into the early years of the man who would later turn Rome into his own personal experiment in how far one emperor could push the boundaries of sanity while still expecting applause. His real name, as you probably recall, was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. But nobody ever calls him that because it sounds a little too formal, and also because Romans preferred shorter names, especially names that made their rulers sound less threatening and more like they should be hanging from the rear-view mirror of a chariot. Caligula, meaning little boot, was the result. He earned this nickname as a child while accompanying his father, Germanicus, on military campaigns. Legionaries adored the boy, partly because he was cute, partly because they missed their own children, and partly because watching a toddler march in tiny boots and miniature armor was a delightful distraction from the daily possibility of being skewered by angry Germanic tribes. So they dressed him up like a pocket-sized soldier and called him Caligula, and the name stuck to him for life, even though he would have preferred something grander, something like Gaius the Magnificent, or the glorious emperor who will absolutely not drain the treasury and declare himself a god. But well, here we are, before we drift too far into the darker corners of his reign. It's helpful to remember that Caligula actually had a relatively tragic childhood. His father Germanicus was wildly popular. Too popular, in fact. So naturally he died under suspicious circumstances. Poison? A curse? Bad oysters? No one ever knew for sure, but everyone suspected foul play. His mother Agrippina, the elder, blamed Emperor Tiberius loudly and frequently, which is not the best strategy when dealing with a man best described as quiet, paranoid, and holding absolute power. She and two of her sons were eventually exiled and died under grim circumstances. Little Gaius, however, survived. And nothing says healthy emotional development like watching your family slowly erase while being kept alive because the emperor can't quite figure out whether you're a threat or a convenient decorative ornament. Tiberius took him in, though not in the warm, grandfatherly figure-baking cookies way. It was more like keeping a snake, because you enjoy the thrill of not knowing if it will someday bite you. During this period, Caligula learned some essential imperial skills. How to smile at people you despise, how to hide personal ambitions behind polite silence, and how to behave normally while living in a place where normal behavior had long since given up and walked into the sea. Tiberius's island villa on Capri was a textbook example of what happens when a powerful man retreats from society, and no one is brave enough to tell him maybe not. When Tiberius finally died, probably naturally, though rumors claim someone gently assisted him into the afterlife, Caligula became emperor. Rome celebrated as if peace, prosperity, and common sense were all about to return for the first few months. They did. Caligula lowered taxes. He released political prisoners. He hosted games and festivals with extravagant generosity. People adored him. He seemed charming, grateful, almost saint-like. It was the greatest honeymoon phase the Roman Empire ever experienced. And then something changed. Maybe it was a sudden illness. Ancient writers suggest he suffered a severe fever, possibly epilepsy, possibly encephalitis. Whatever it was, it left him altered. The charm dimmed, the generosity warped, and something sharp and restless emerged in its place. And from this point onward, the palace became quite an interesting place to work, especially if you were unfortunately assigned to what we might gently describe as the emperor's personal entertainment staff. If you belonged to this unlucky group, you learned quickly that life was a careful balancing act, not a power, because you had none, but of guessing what mood your emperor might be in at any given moment. Caligula, for reasons we will glide over lightly, developed a talent for acquiring people, beautiful people, vulnerable people, people with no political protection, no wealthy family members, and no ability to say no. He took them the same way a child might collect shiny stones, carelessly, impulsively, and then forget about them. Those forced into his palace service rarely had names recorded in history. They faded into the background like shadows clinging to marble walls. And it was not just physical desire. Many of these individuals were also props in Caligula's grand experiments in humiliation. He enjoyed proving that power meant bending others to his whims. Making senators dine beside enslaved entertainers, he owned was not unusual. He liked the discomfort. It made him feel taller, perhaps emotionally tall, even if physically he remained decidedly average. One of the strangest habits he developed, though softening the tone here a bit, is that he would select people for purely random reasons. A gesture, a hairstyle, the way someone happened to be standing near a column. If something about you caught his eye, that was it. You belonged to him. There was no deeper logic, no process, no explanation, just impulse. Life inside the palace for these enslaved individuals was a strange cycle of intense scrutiny and crushing boredom. One day, Caligula might summon them for an elaborate display of affection in front of visiting dignitaries. The next day, he might forget their existence entirely. Some spent weeks sealed inside rooms with no idea if they were still considered valuable or if they were simply being saved for a future whim. And of course, Rome whispered. Senators wrinkled their noses in public, while quietly envying the emperor's freedom. Outsiders told lurid stories, each one more exaggerated than the last. But the truth, drifting softly beneath the rumors, is that Caligula simply didn't see people as people. They were amusement, living ornaments, pieces of luxury to be arranged or discarded. The saddest part? Many of the enslaved individuals brought into his palace were children or teenagers captured during wars or bought in markets. They were far from home, unable to speak Latin fluently, and entirely dependent on palace attendants who were themselves terrified. They formed small friendships in shadows, whispered alliances, tiny acts of comfort, soft moments of humanity in a place that offered none. And yet, it is worth remembering that even among all this, the palace was not a non-stop carnival of chaos. Much of the time, it was quiet, too quiet, long marble corridors echoing with soft footsteps, silk curtains barely moving, servants speaking in murmurs. Even Caligula couldn't sustain madness 24 hours a day. Sometimes he simply lounged, bored, played with his jewels, planning meaningless projects. One of his favorite pastimes was summoning groups of people and then observing their reactions as he delivered confusing instructions. Should they smile? Bow? Laugh? Cry? Who knew? One wrong expression could be interpreted as treason. You can imagine the tension this created. Enslaved entertainers became experts at reading micro-expressions. If Caligula lifted an eyebrow, smiled too widely, or tapped a finger, they knew a mood shift was coming. And of course, he favored certain individuals more than others. Those favorites received slightly more comfortable rooms, better food, and a higher chance of surviving. The others, well, they tried their best to become invisible, but being invisible was dangerous. 2. Caligula despised anything that reminded him of limits. If someone faded too far into the background, he might suddenly decide to assert control over them just to prove he could. It was a strange game, one no one wanted to play, despite everything. There were small pieces of grim humor sprinkled throughout the palace, tiny ways the enslaved people coped. They sometimes nicknamed Caligula behind his back, giving him gentle, whispered titles like the Restless One or the Emperor of Sudden Ideas. Nothing too bold, of course. They weren't reckless. But even soft humor kept them sane. Others formed quiet routines. Some would clean the same mosaic tile 50 times a day. Some hummed songs from their homelands under their breath. Some daydreamed about escape. Even though escape from a Roman imperial palace was roughly as possible as casually strolling out a volcano. But imagination is powerful, especially in places where reality feels too heavy. Meanwhile, outside those palace walls, the Roman public kept telling themselves that Caligula must have had a good reason for everything he did. After all, emperors were chosen by fate, by the gods. Surely, divine will wouldn't put someone entirely unfit in charge of the most powerful empire on earth, right? This was a comforting thought. Comforting thoughts are helpful when you're trying not to think too hard about the fact that your emperor declared war on the sea and ordered soldiers to collect seashells as spoils of victory. But let's drift away from the wider empire for now and float back to the palace itself. Where the enslaved staff lived in a delicate world of whispers and footsteps. One of the most exhausting parts of their existence was the uncertainty. They never knew when they would be summoned. Days blended into each other. Lack of sleep became normal. The palace was always lit with flickering lamps. Someone was always awake. Caligula didn't follow anything resembling a schedule, so no one else could either. And yet, in the middle of these sleepless nights, people found ways to soothe each other. Some prayed, some braided each other's hair, some cried silently, and someone else would offer a comforting touch or a scrap of cloth to wipe their face. Human softness survived, even in the harshest corners. As Caligula's reign continued, his behavior grew more unpredictable. At one moment, he might shower someone with gifts. The next moment, he'd accuse them of betrayal, usually based on nothing more than a passing thought. This fragile emotional environment meant that every person in his orbit lived on constant edge. And ironically, this only made Caligula more paranoid. He sensed fear everywhere. Nervous glances, stiff postures, trembling hands. He interpreted these as signs of conspiracy, not symptoms of living under a deeply unstable ruler. But despite all this tension, the enslaved staff rarely revolted. They couldn't. They had no weapons, no allies, and often no shared language. And even if they had managed to escape, Rome itself was not particularly welcoming to escaped palace servants. The city belonged to the emperor. There was nowhere to run. Yet they endured. People are surprisingly resilient when they have no other choice. Some survived Caligula's reign, lived to see his assassination, and finally walked into sunlight without fear being summoned. Others weren't so lucky. Their stories faded into the palace walls. And now that we've drifted gently through these dim corridors and quiet tragedies, let's pause with a soft breath and reflect a moment. If you had found yourself in Caligula's palace, surrounded by whispering servants, unpredictable moods, and endless confusion, what quiet coping strategy do you think you would have used? Tell me softly in the comments if you're awake enough. Or let the thought drift into your dreams if you're slipping into sleep. Whenever you're ready, we'll drift onward. Let's drift back now, softly, slowly into that uneasy world we were exploring before. The lamps of Caligula's palace are still flickering. The corridors still stretching on like marble rivers. And the people who lived in those shadowed spaces are still waiting, listening, wondering what mood might fall over them next. The night never really ended there. It simply stretched into the next one, like time itself had grown tired and decided to stop bothering with mornings. When we left off, we were watching the enslaved entertainers and attendants of the palace navigate their days with almost no certainty. And as Caligula sank more deeply into his own impulses, the pressure on those closest to him only grew heavier. Yet somehow, in the way humans always do, they adapted. They learned the strange language of surviving him. They became experts in reading tension in the air, experts in predicting which of his whims might erupt next, and experts in staying just quiet enough to avoid inviting attention. But let's drift gently now into another part of Caligula's behavior. Something a little slower, a little stranger, and somehow even more exhausting for people around him. Caligula began developing obsessions. Small ones, pointless ones, little interests that consumed his entire focus for a few days or weeks. And when the most powerful man in the empire becomes fixated on something trivial, well, everyone else must suddenly care very deeply about that thing too. There was a period, for instance, when Caligula obsessed over specific horses. Not just his famous favorite, Incitatus, though we'll drift to him in a moment, but also several others he found aesthetically pleasing. He'd wander through the palace stables at odd hours, inspecting them, commenting on the shine of their coats, the straightness of their legs, the way their ears flicked. He spoke to them as though they were his advisors. And enslaved grooms working there had to bow, smile, and nod respectfully to the horses as well as the emperor. You might imagine how nerve-wracking this was. If the emperor believed your horse was having a difficult day or looked stressed, the horse might be escorted to a lavish chamber for rest, while you were punished for failing to treat it with enough devotion. And if Caligula declared that a certain horse needed to be fed almonds dipped in gold flakes, well, your job became finding gold flakes at 2 a.m. This erratic devotion stretched to other animals, too. Caligula adored exotic pets. Lions, peacocks, monkeys, and occasionally creatures that no one in Rome had even seen before, dragged from distant lands by traders who recognized an emperor's obsession as a tremendously profitable business opportunity. For the enslaved caretakers, this meant days spent coaxing confused animals into behaving like palace-trained pets. Rome wasn't exactly built for tropical birds or desert creatures. Some animals refused to cooperate, and in those cases, the keepers often faced the consequences, not the animal. And in the middle of this animal-filled chaos stood Incitatus, Caligula's most beloved horse. You probably heard that Caligula planned to make him a consul, which is true, or at least close enough to the truth that historians shrug and say, it sounds like something he'd do. But the palace staff lived with the daily burden of making sure this horse looked and behaved like an animal worthy of political office. They fed him oats mixed with wine. They dressed him in purple blankets. They built him a marble stall and assigned guards to protect him at night. Some enslaved attendants found a strange comfort in the horse's presence. At least Incitatus didn't shout, accuse, or demand impossible tasks. He simply stood there, pleasantly confused, chewing something expensive. And on hard days, a few servants whispered to him the way one might talk to a patient friend. Perhaps it helped. Perhaps even Incitatus wondered what kind of empire he had wandered into. But animals were only one part of Caligula's obsessions. Another, more difficult one was his fascination with divine status. He didn't just want to be emperor. He wanted to be a living god, a being whom people worshipped, bowed to, and offered sacrifices for. At first, this was merely symbolic. A statue here, a temple there. But soon, Caligula demanded that people treat him as though he were actually divine, which created a new set of challenges for those forced to serve him closely. If the emperor suddenly believed he was Jupiter, then you had to speak to him as though lightning might burst from his hands at any moment. If he felt like Neptune, you had to pretend to fear his power over the sea. If he declared himself a new form of Apollo, you needed to compliment his singing. Even though Caligula sang the way a baby goat might, if the goat were slightly tipsy and extremely confident. And for the enslaved courtiers who lived nearest to him, and who were often pulled unwillingly into these divine pageants, this meant endless rehearsals of flattery. They practiced how deeply to bow, how long to pause when praising him, how to keep their facial expressions relaxed and respectful, even when he demanded they kneel and address him as Lord of all light, a title no one had ever used before and likely no one will ever use again. This divine role-playing extended into the palace architecture. 2. Certain rooms were redesigned to resemble temples. Courtiers had to burn incense whenever Caligula entered, even if the emperor immediately complained about the smell. Some enslaved attendants had the misfortune of being assigned to hold torches, real burning torches, for hours while Caligula seated himself on a throne, waiting for people to admire him. Their arms ached. Their clothes smelled like smoke, but they dared not shift their weight because any movement might be interpreted as disrespect. This wasn't the dramatic, theatrical madness Hollywood loves to portray. It was slow, repetitive, tedious madness, the kind that wears people down inch by inch, day by day. And yet, even as Caligula drifted deeper into these fantasies, there were moments when he simply seemed tired, worn out, restless in a way that even absolute power couldn't soothe. Some nights, he would order musicians to play soft melodies for him, long into the early hours. Enslaved dancers would perform slow, swaying movements, almost like lullabies in motion. Caligula would sit there staring, neither happy nor angry, just distant. Perhaps he longed for something he couldn't name. Perhaps power is lonelier than anyone imagines. Those closest to him saw this and occasionally felt a touch of sympathy, not enough to change anything, but enough to remind them that even tyrants are human. A deeply dangerous thought, but a human one nonetheless. Still, sympathy didn't mean safety. Caligula's unpredictability never faded. Some days he rewarded people generously. Other days, he punished them without explanation. His inner circle lived suspended in uncertainty, like lanterns swinging gently in a drafty corridor. And when fate finally caught up with him, few were surprised. Shocked, yes, but not surprised. We'll drift toward that moment soon, but not yet. There's still a bit of gentle wandering to do first. One of Caligula's favorite activities in the later part of his reign was hosting elaborate banquets. These were not the lively, communal gatherings often romanticized in art. They were long, quiet, uncomfortable affairs where guests ate in near silence, afraid to speak unless Caligula addressed them. The enslaved servants who staffed these dinners had to move with perfect precision, refilling cups at the exact right moment, adjusting torches, replacing cushions, carrying platters loaded with dishes that no ordinary Roman would ever have tasted. Meanwhile, Caligula observed everything. His eyes darted from guest to guest, looking for signs of boredom or disapproval. Anyone who seemed too cheerful was suspicious. Anyone who seemed too sad was also suspicious. Anyone who looked confused might be accused of plotting something. So the safest expression was a soft, neutral one, relaxed enough to avoid looking terrified, but deferential enough to show respect. It was a facial performance that exhausted even the most experienced courtiers. Servants whispered among themselves afterward how surreal these dinners were, how guests barely touched the extravagant food, how everyone waited for Caligula's smallest reaction before daring to react themselves, how the emperor sometimes became fascinated with a single dish and demanded to be served 20 times in a row, or how he occasionally announced sudden philosophical declarations that made no sense, but were greeted with polite applause anyway. And through all this, the enslaved staff simply kept working, quiet, steady, careful. Because in a palace where power flowed from one unstable source, the safest thing you could be was useful. Even outside the palace, life felt unstable. Caligula's projects drained the treasury. His decisions baffled the Senate. His demands strained the patience of Rome. But inside those marble halls, none of that mattered. The people closest to him lived in a bubble, like fish inside a vast, ornate bowl. Everything outside was distant. Everything inside depended on one man's mood. And perhaps the strangest part of it all was that the palace staff saw more of Caligula's humanity than the senators ever did. They saw the moments when he muttered to himself, pacing in corridors. The moments when he paused to stare at a statue, as though trying to understand something. The moments when fatigue drifted across his face before he composed himself again. They saw him laugh softly at a joke no one else heard. They heard him whisper a name from his childhood during a fevered dream. All of these small glimpses made him feel a little less like a monster and a little more like a lost person who happened to hold power too enormous for any single mind to carry safely. But power doesn't forgive weakness, and Rome certainly didn't. As we drift toward the next part of the story, maybe take a moment to imagine what you might have noticed if you've been a quiet servant in the corner, someone holding a tray, pretending not to see anything. What small human detail do you think you would have observed that history never wrote down? If you're awake enough, let me know softly in the comments. And if you're drifting off, that's fine too. Your thoughts can float alongside us as we move gently onward. Let's settle back in gently, quietly, right where we drifted away last time. The lamps of imperial corridors are still glowing with that soft amber haze, and the uneasy hush around Caligula's palace, so familiar by now, still lingers like a thin veil of smoke. In Part 9, we had drifted to the slow unraveling of the Emperor's final months, that strange period when he seemed both invincible and impossibly fragile, as though even he wasn't sure which version of himself would wake up each morning. And the people around him, those closest, those farthest, those trapped in the palace's orbit, walked on eggshells softer than the silk cushions Caligula never stopped ordering by the dozens. We watched senators pretend to respect him, servants pretend not to fear him, and the emperor pretend that he was still in control of his own crumbling empire. Now, in this soft continuation, we'll drift closer to the end of his reign, the part that ancient historians love turning into dramatic theater. But we're not going to rush. There's no drama here tonight, just a slow, steady unraveling, a quiet slide toward an imperial end that was almost inevitable, like a candle slowly burning itself out. For the palace staff, the enslaved entertainers, attendants, and personal servants, the weeks before Caligula's assassination were some of the most confusing of all, because, strangely enough, Caligula wasn't at his worst, or at least not in the loud, extravagant ways people always imagine. Most days he was simply weary, restless, a man who had climbed to the top of the world only to discover that the air up there was too thin for breathing. His temper still flared, of course, often at random. A misplaced cup, a dish served too warm, a servant who blinked at the wrong rhythm. And yet even those outbursts had begun to lose their intensity. They were less volcanic and more like distant thunder. Unpleasant, yes, but not as explosive as they once had been. Many in the palace wondered if Caligula was sick again. Illness had shaped him before, twisted him into someone sharper, darker. Now, it seemed to be softening him in strange ways. Some nights, he wandered the palace hallways alone, or nearly alone, with only one or two attendants following from a cautious distance. He muttered to himself, asking questions no one dared answer. Sometimes he spoke to statues, Jupiter, Augustus, Apollo, as though they were old friends. Other times he stared into the gardens, watching the torchlight flicker over fountains and marble. Once, an enslaved musician passing by heard Caligula whisper, "Father, I tried." The musician walked faster, praying the emperor wouldn't notice. These rare glimpses, these tiny, unguarded cracks in the armor, were things only the palace ghosts got to see. The senators never did. The city never did. Meanwhile, the Senate had grown more restless. Caligula's demands had drained the treasury. His public appearances were unpredictable. His laws, when he bothered to announce them at all, felt like jokes that no one understood. His guards, the Praetorians, were rumored to be tired of protecting a man who didn't seem interested in protecting himself. But inside the palace, the enslaved attendants weren't thinking about conspiracies. They were thinking about routines, about the long hours spent waiting outside locked doors, about the quiet moans they heard when Caligula tried to sleep, about the new strange orders he gave, like demanding that a garden fountain be filled with wine at dawn, and then forgetting the request entirely. One soft, pale morning, he summoned several attendants and demanded that they accompany him to a newly constructed bridge-like platform he had built between parts of the palace. Historians later called it unnecessary, ridiculous, wasteful, but the servants who walked with him remembered something different. They remembered how he paused midway across it, looking out over Rome, his expression strained. He asked them if they could hear the city breathing. They said yes, of course. They always said yes. Then he whispered, "It sounds tired." The servants nodded again, agreeing was the safest option. But quietly, deep inside themselves, they understood what he meant. Rome was tired. Tired of fear. Tired of spectacle. Tired of pretending. And Caligula, in his own way, sensed the truth of it. Even the feasts he once adored had lost their shine. He still held them, because emperors did, and because the Senate expected him to distract the public with entertainment. But the atmosphere had changed. The guests sat stiffly. The musicians played softer than usual. The enslaved cupbearers, who had once been terrified of spilling a drop, now simply felt weary from the entire ritual. Caligula himself often ate very little. He picked at grapes, stirred a bowl of figs without tasting any, stared into the distance as though something far beyond the palace walls held his attention. Sometimes he gave speeches that wandered aimlessly, stories from his childhood, memories of Germany's cold forests, questions about fate, the kind of rambling monologue one gives when they're speaking mostly to themselves. But even these gentler moods had shadows. One night, during a quieter feast, a young enslaved dancer accidentally dropped a veil. It drifted to the floor with barely a sound. Caligula's expression tightened. Guests froze. The servants froze. The dancer trembled. But instead of erupting, Caligula simply stared at the fallen veil. Then he said in a soft voice, "Everything falls eventually, doesn't it?" No one dared respond. The dancer wasn't punished. Caligula waved her away with an exhausted motion, and the whole room exhaled at once, like people waking from a collective nightmare. Little moments like that made the palace staff uneasy. A calmer Caligula wasn't necessarily a safer Caligula. He seemed unpredictable in a new, quieter way, like a storm cloud that didn't thunder but still blocked the sun. And then there were the dreams. Servants posted outside his chamber heard him talking at night, whispering, arguing with someone who wasn't there, sometimes crying out, sometimes laughing bitterly. Some nights he paced until dawn, others he refused to sleep, demanding storytellers to speak until he finally drifted off in a chair. One night, he ordered an enslaved storyteller, a young man from the eastern provinces, to tell him myths about kings who fell from power. The storyteller froze. There were no safe myths in that category. But he tried. He spoke softly, choosing his words carefully, describing tales of pride, destiny, and fragile mortality. Caligula listened quietly. At one point, he asked, "Do they all die?" The storyteller hesitated, then nodded. In stories, great men usually do. Caligula stared at him for a long time. The room was utterly silent. The guards held their breath. The attendants waited for an explosion. But instead, Caligula murmured, "I suppose that's fair," and sent the young man away unharmed. By the time the Saturnalia festival approached, the tension within the palace had reached a strange calm. Not peaceful calm, not happy calm, but the kind of stillness you find right before a vase tips off a shelf or a branch snaps under too much snow. The kind of stillness that feels like it's waiting. The Praetorian Guard was restless. The Senate was whispering. Even ordinary citizens, who rarely learned palace news until much later, felt something shifting in the air. Inside the palace, the enslaved staff didn't know the details, but they felt the shift too. Guards walked with straighter posture. Senators spoke in quieter tones. Some began avoiding the palace altogether. Others visited too frequently, as though trying to read omens in the emperor's face. And Caligula himself? He floated through the strange atmosphere with a kind of resigned detachment, not quite oblivious, not quite aware, somewhere in between. One evening, he held his infant daughter in his arms, little Julia Drusilla, and stared at her silently for such a long time that even the nursemaid grew nervous. Finally, he whispered, "I hope you never understand me." The nursemaid didn't respond. She simply adjusted the child's blanket, bowing her head. Meanwhile, in the servants' quarters, whispers grew. No one dared predict anything, but there was a sense, an instinct, that something was ending soon. Even those who disliked the emperor found themselves torn. His anger had been terrifying. His whims had been cruel. His demands had shaped their entire lives. But the idea of a shift in power? Change was frightening too, because new emperors brought new rules and new dangers. Some servants prayed quietly for safety. Others packed away small personal items, tokens from home, scraps of cloth, a trinket gifted by a fellow attendant, just in case they needed a run. Most simply waited. Waiting was what they had always done best. The night before Caligula's assassination was oddly quiet. Too quiet. He seemed in a better mood than usual. He ate more than he had in weeks. He even complimented a musician without sounding sarcastic. And for once, he slept deeply. No pacing. No muttering. No restless movement. It was the kind of calm that unsettles people more than chaos ever could. The next morning would change everything. But we'll drift into that moment in the next part, slowly, gently. There's no need to rush toward an ending. Before we move on, think about this softly. If you've been living in that palace, exhausted, confused, unsure, would a quiet before the end have comforted you, or made you even more uneasy? If you're awake, whisper your thoughts in the comments. Hey everyone, welcome back. Or welcome forward, really, because at this point in the journey, time has become very soft around the edges. If you're still awake, congratulations. If you drifted in and out like a bored Roman senator during another one of Caligula's midnight monologues, that's perfectly fine too. Either way, let's just sink back into that familiar quiet, the kind where the air feels a bit heavier, the lights feel a little warmer, and history just sort of sloshes around like lukewarm soup in an oversized marble bowl. When we left off in part 11, we'd wandered through the strange, oddly specific, and occasionally mold-scented corners of ancient luxury, those little glimpses of everyday royal nonsense that somehow explained everything and nothing about how power worked. It all seemed grand from the outside, and then we looked closer and realized, perfect. It's just another ruling family barely holding things together with anxiety, questionable hygiene, and a few expensive fabrics. So let's drift just a little further into that last pocket of sleepy history, where the political merges with the personal, and the personal collapses into a faint pile of inherited nonsense. Because if there's one thing we've learned in this 2-hour wander, it's that royal life was rarely the glamorous, silken dream we like to imagine. More often, it was a human equivalent of a decorative fruit bowl, beautiful from afar, quietly rotting underneath. And as we glide into this closing stretch, I thought we'd finish by lingering with a few more of history's great power figures. People who, despite holding enormous influence, still manage to live in constant discomfort, confusion, or plain bad luck. It's oddly comforting, in a way, a reminder that even emperors had days where everything felt vaguely sticky and nothing made sense. Let's start with a man who embodied that energy perfectly. Emperor Claudius, the beloved awkward uncle of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The poor man was never supposed to rule, which is probably why he did. The empire looked at the available options after Caligula's very inconvenient murder and collectively said, "You know what? Let's just give the crown to the guy hiding behind the curtains. At least he's quiet." Claudius had spent most of his early life tucked away like a family secret, mostly because his relatives decided he seemed a little too wobbly and slow. And to be fair, he did have that slightly dazed look of someone who had wandered into the wrong palace room and wasn't entirely sure how to leave. Ancient writers mocked his limp, his stutter, his habit of drooling when nervous, all things that made his blue-blooded relatives wince because, of course, they wanted their rulers sleek and polished, not shaped like the human equivalent of a water-damaged scroll. And yet, for all the teasing, Claudius had one thing the rest of the dynasty lacked: actual competence, which must have been deeply annoying for everyone who underestimated him. While the rest of the family was busy lighting luxury on fire, sometimes literally, Claudius was quietly studying history, languages, administration, and all the boring things that accidentally prepare you to manage an empire. But he wasn't exactly thriving. He spent his reign in a state of polite surprise, like someone who keeps winning raffles he never entered. And he married 4 times, which was ambitious, given how each one went progressively worse. His final wife, the infamous Agrippina the Younger, treated their marriage like a corporate takeover. She positioned her son Nero as heir, rearranged the household staff, and, according to several suspiciously convenient historians, may have decided that Claudius had served his purpose and could be gently nudged into the afterlife with a plate of poisoned mushrooms. Now, whether or not the mushrooms were actually poison is one of those debates scholars love to keep alive, because it gives them an excuse to say mushrooms a lot in academic conferences. But whatever the cause, Claudius left the world the same way he lived in it. Quietly overwhelmed, slightly confused, and probably wishing he'd ordered something less exciting for dinner. Which brings us neatly to Nero, his successor, his stepson, and a man who treated the imperial throne like a personal talent show. Nero always wanted to be a performer, preferably one with dramatic lighting and extended applause breaks. Unfortunately, he was born into the wrong career path. Being emperor meant he had to make decisions, and Nero's feelings about decision-making can be summarized as, what if someone else handled that while I practice my lute? People often imagine Nero as this terrifying, cackling villain, but he was more like that theater kid who never outgrew the spotlight phase and accidentally inherited the nuclear codes. He wasn't so much evil as he was terribly unprepared and deeply self-involved, traits that tend to cause problems when you're running the largest empire on Earth. He also had that delightful strain of dynastic inbreeding that gave many Julio-Claudians their signature features: a tendency toward dramatics, delicate health, and inability to make good choices under literally any circumstances. Nero had all 3 in abundance. He spent evenings performing poetry recitations so long that senators pretended to faint just to escape. His domestic life was a parade of bad ideas, including multiple marriages that ended less than ideally. And of course, there's that tiny rumor about him playing music while Rome burned, a story that's not exactly accurate, but is undeniably on brand for him. The real Nero probably panicked, blamed everyone else, and then punished the wrong people, which, again, was very much his style. But what makes Nero oddly human and sleepily fascinating was just how deeply he wanted to be loved. He wanted applause. He wanted admiration. He wanted a kind of approval that only a deeply anxious imperial teenager with access to too much gold could crave. Sadly, that longing didn't make him a better ruler. It just made him more chaotic. And when the empire finally gave up on him, Nero died in disgrace, whispering the very poetic line, "What an artist dies in me," which, on one hand, is melodramatic. On the other hand, honestly, fair enough. If your whole identity revolves around dramatic flair, you might as well commit to it until the final breath. Let's drift from Rome for a moment to breathe in some cooler air, perhaps from the windswept edges of medieval Europe, where royal misery took on a gentler, draftier flavor. Consider Charles VI of France, often called Charles the Mad, which was not the most sensitive nickname anyone has ever received. Charles experienced severe mental illness, which manifested in unpredictable episodes where he forgot who he was, believed he was made of glass, and even demanded iron bars sewn into his clothing so he wouldn't shatter. His advisors tried to manage things, but medieval medicine was, let's call it enthusiastic, but not particularly effective. The treatments ranged from cold baths to prayers to gently removing him from rooms before he frightened guests. It would be easy to laugh at the absurdity, but honestly, it's mostly sad. Charles never wanted the crown. He inherited it young, unprepared, and not entirely stable. His reign became one long attempt to balance governance with personal crisis, an exhausting, lonely life that makes you wonder how many rulers through history were secretly unraveling behind the scenes. And the court around him? Naturally, they made everything worse. Nobles fought for power during his unstable periods. Factions formed, wars escalated, and through it all, Charles wandered the palace halls, trying his best to stay intact, emotionally and, according to his glass delusion, physically. If history teaches us anything, it's that kings and queens rarely had the luxury of falling apart quietly. Their breakdowns were public, political, and endlessly exploited. Charles VI just had the misfortune of breaking down harder than most. Drifting onward, we reach another royal who had a complicated relationship with, well, everything. Philip V of Spain, one of the many Bourbons who seemed designed by nature to demonstrate why Europe desperately needed better genetic diversity. Philip suffered long periods of depression and anxiety, punctuated by strange behaviors that bewildered the court. Some days, he refused to change clothes. Other days, he wouldn't speak. Occasionally, he stayed in bed so long that entire governmental decisions piled up at the foot of it like unopened mail. His second wife, Elizabeth Farnese, basically ruled in his place, guiding him through episodes and managing affairs of state, while Philip stared at the ceiling, wondering why existence needed to be so exhausting. The thing about fragile bloodlines is that they didn't care how important you were. You could wear the finest silk, command armies, possess unimaginable wealth, and still wake up every morning feeling like you were held together by the emotional equivalent of damp parchment. It's one of those tiny ironies of monarchy that makes history feel both tragic and strangely relatable. And now, as we float gently toward the end of our long, drowsy journey, we arrive at one last figure, someone who captures the entire theme of this video. George III of Britain, the king who lost America and his own stability in almost equal measure. George III was, by all accounts, a decent man. He loved farming, family life, and quiet routines. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't cruel. He was simply earnest. Unfortunately, earnestness isn't enough when you're dealing with political upheaval, revolutionary sentiment, and a persistent hereditary illness that affected your mind in progressively devastating waves. His famous periods of madness were heartbreaking rather than humorous. He spoke endlessly, unable to stop. He experienced hallucinations. He talked to trees. He sang loudly at inappropriate times and wept without warning. His family tried to help, but treatment were limited to restraints, isolation, and prayers, none of which address a root cause. By the end of his life, George III lived in near-complete darkness, physically and mentally. And yet, throughout it all, he remained strangely sympathetic, a reminder that kings were ultimately just human beings trapped inside systems that demanded perfection from them. And now, we've reached the quiet edge of our story, a long, drifting tour through palaces, bedrooms, banquet halls, and private chambers where emperors cried, kings panicked, queens plotted, and nobles wonder how their entire world became so complicated. We've looked at their odd habits, their fragile bodies, their fragile minds, and the dynasties that tied them all together in webs of blood, duty, and questionable decisions. It's easy to romanticize royalty, but the closer you look, the clearer it becomes that most rulers were simply exhausted people born into jobs they couldn't quit. They endured pressure, scrutiny, and expectations that would unravel almost anyone. Their lives make good stories, yes, but they also make excellent reminders that being powerful is not the same as being free. And as we close the final chapter of this sleepy wander through history's private corners, I hope you found something oddly soothing in the fact that even the most celebrated figures were confused, stressed, sick, dramatic, and sometimes deeply ridiculous. If you've drifted off during any moment, wonderful. If you're still here, gently awake, thank you for staying with me through every soft step of this 2-hour journey. Now, before we wrap up completely, let me ask you one last quiet question. If you had to live under any of the rulers we explored tonight, which one do you think you'd survive the longest under? Let me know softly in the comments. And now, Crescent Moon final closing section. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. If you enjoyed this slow drift through the dim corridors of history, feel free to leave a like or share the video with someone who could use a gentle escape. And if you'd like to join me again for more sleepy historical wanderings, you can subscribe. As always, no pressure, just a soft invitation. Sleep well or stay awake thoughtfully, and I'll see you in the next quiet journey through the past.